Adam's presentation gave me the thought about the importance of the Cold War as a legacy. And I remembered two statements that Kim Beazley, who was Kim Beazley Jr., one of the beneficiaries of Whitlam's leadership and reform of the Labor Party, two statements that he made. One was to describe President Obama as the first post-Cold War President of the United States. Of course, the Cold War ended in 1989. So there's a 20-year gap before you get the first post-Cold War president. But thinking during Adam's presentation, there are elements in which Whitlam was the first post-Cold War Prime Minister of Australia. He was trying to move beyond the constraints of the Cold War in an international situation which made that very difficult. And I'll try to elaborate some of the difficulties. The other comment that Kim Beazley made, which perhaps might not have been endorsed by Gough Whitlam, but maybe so, is don't tell me too much about theory when you come to international politics. It's all about practical decisions. That's more or less a paraphrase. But what I've tried to do in this short paper is to give some conceptual framework for understanding the failure of Whitlam's internationalism in East Timor, as well as its success in the other three cases that I briefly look at, which are the opposition to French nuclear testing, the independence of Papua New Guinea, and his strident and bold description of Australia's responsibility to Indigenous peoples. The other comment I'll just make at the start is about 3 months ago, when there were certain political events going on in Canberra, Chris Bowen had something on his social media. I'm not very up with social media, but there was almost a coincidence in the number of days in which Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Turnbull were Prime Ministers. And Bowen listed Whitlam's achievements down a full page, no doubt an abbreviated list, and Turnbull's achievements were absent. And it is not simply a partisan view in terms of what James has just said about Whitlam's significance as a Prime Minister of change. That really is profound. So when we're looking at the case of failure, it's important because of the standard or the bar that he set was so high. But what I try to do is explain why did he fail to fulfill his internationalist inclinations or aspirations in the Timor case compared to these other three cases. And I try to do this by explaining where did Whitlam's internationalism fit in relation to other views, and that's where sort of the element of theory comes in. And the theory is drawn from a book by Hedley Bull, The Anarchical Society, which was probably written by 1975. It was published in 1977. It might have been written sort of, or certainly being in the process of being written during the Whitlam.
It was articles.
Yeah. And Bull has a particular clever way of presenting three views of international affairs. One is the realist view, which is actually not realist in my view, but it's the crude power politics view. And Bull puts that on one extreme. The other extreme is the universalist or Kantian view. That's not what matters is relations between states so much as the international community of mankind or humanity. And Bull puts his preferred view, which he names after the famous European international lawyer Hugo Grotius, as the intermediary position. And it's a clever little rhetorical trick. There are these two extremes, and the best one is the one in the middle. Part of the argument that I'm making for the reason for Whitlam's failure over East Timor is that he did, in practice, embody that middle position of Grotian internationalism for which the priority is orderly relations amongst states. And in the world as it exists, in the system of states, or the society of states as Paul called it, human rights can be pursued consistently only in certain or exceptional circumstances. That's actually Ball's theory. My argument, excuse me, is in a sense to turn Ball's theory on his head and suggest that where Whitlam succeeded was when his main approach, which was this Grotian internationalism, where that was influenced not by power politics, but rather by a universalist set of aspirations. And the three cases that I give where he succeeded with his internationalism, they're not perhaps, or at least two of them, were not as difficult as the Timor case, those being the opposition to French testing and completing urgently independence for Papua New Guinea. So that's in a sense the argument I'm making, that Whitlam's main approach was one of Grotian internationalism, which favours orderly relations amongst states. Where he succeeded was when there were not strong pressures from power politics, or he was able to resist those pressures or challenge them. Where he failed was when those pressures were strong. And that's sort of in a much more complicated story as to why was there this presumption about the importance of having an orderly relation with Indonesia at all costs. And I think that the answer then comes down to, well, that's because of fears and insecurity, ultimately, about Indonesia's position in the region and Australia's national security. Another important thing to bear in mind, I'll sort of try to sort of mention this and then go through the cases without giving too much attention to the East Timor one, because that's already been covered, is the difficulties in terms of the international context. In this book about Australia and the United Nations that James and David have edited, I give a periodisation of the UN. And the middle period, there are 5 periods. We're currently still in, I think, no, we've shifted from the age of expectations to the age of disappointment, which more or less came in at the end of the 1990s. So we're in an extended period of disappointment now. But for almost 20 years, from the early 1970s until the late 1980s, the UN was in what can be described as the age of stagnation. It was very difficult, to get the UN to do anything positive. There are some exceptions. It's significant that the case where Whitlam succeeded most in involving the United Nations was with the International Court of Justice case against French testing. He was using an institution that then was not corrupted by power politics. It's an interesting hypothetical as to what might have happened if, in October 1974, Australia, which was then on the Security Council, had tried to get the Security Council to have an investigation into what was happening in Portuguese Timor at the time. Of course, it's a hypothetical, but in the end, given the stagnant nature of the United Nations at the time, the Security Council, and the very strong support there had been from the Western powers for Suharto's authoritarian regime, it was a very difficult circumstance in which to pursue a successful internationalist policy. But the argument on the first case is that Whitlam's internationalism was constrained by this power politics environment, and he sort of accepted that. It's no excuse, but he didn't, as most people didn't expect the events to occur as quickly as they did. In October 1973, Whitlam, at the end of a long discussion with the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, was asked by Zhou Enlai, what's going to happen in Portuguese Timor? His answer was, and I paraphrase, nothing much. he wasn't sort of, and no one was really prepared for what was going to happen, but accepting that there were opportunities to pursue a different policy, the context was very difficult. Now, to look at the case of French nuclear testing, this was successful, as I've said, because Whitlam managed to use one of the institutions of the United Nations, the International Court of Justice, in order to promote two things. One, Australian regional leadership of the South Pacific, and that's something else that's sort of been lacking subsequently, but that was the first motivation. But the second motivation, which is where you can see evidence of Whitlam as a post-Cold War Prime Minister, is what was the aspiration? The aspiration was that to get beyond nuclear weapons. And if you look at the text of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it's read as a properly multilateral treaty, there is an obligation for all state parties to the treaty to pursue in good faith negotiations to lead to nuclear disarmament. Now, you can see from that case, even though he was only dealing initially with French testing, French atmospheric testing, when he met Zhou Enlai in Beijing in October 1973, he was not reticent about criticising Chinese testing. So, and the point about the aspiration, even though the diplomatic angle, and I think one of the most valuable points of Adam's paper is this categorisation of the internationalist dimension and the bilateral diplomatic dimension as two strands. And with regard to Timor, the bilateral dimension, or what I've called the Grotian vision of orderly relations amongst states, predominated. With regard to the opposition to French testing, it was inspired not only by the bilateral dimension, but by this commitment to a world without nuclear weapons, which is where one can draw a parallel historically with Obama and with Beasley's description of that. And it leads on to subsequent International Court of Justice case in 1995 and to the treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons from last year. The case of PNG independence is relatively straightforward compared to the other ones because there was no real opposition. But it fitted in so clearly with Whitlam's main foreign policy agenda of changing Australia's image in the world. It was the urgency of doing it. And he'd seen the need to complete that transition before the UN sort of, in a sense, got involved. And there was no real opposition. But the one comment I make about that is that in contrast to the previous period with Evatt, Whitlam had no inclination in supporting and Papua New Guinea becoming independent, no inclination to suggest that there should be some reservations on PNG sovereignty with regard to sort of Australian bases. And that reflects his foreign policy being, as he said, less militarily oriented. Okay, I'll try to finish in a minute or two. That's fine. The fourth case is perhaps the most difficult. The Timor case is very difficult, but the fourth case is recognition of a rightful place for Indigenous peoples in Australia. And there have been a number of statements by Prime Ministers, as well as non-statements by other Prime Ministers. But I think it's very clear, if one compares Whitlam's election speech in 1972, the policy speech, which for someone in this day and age, going back to Frank's presentation, is remarkably honest and forthright as a mandate and a program. This is just an aside, Frank, but maybe if you compare that election speech with others, such as John Howard in 1996. There was a cartoon where Howard was unwilling to even to declare his policy on spin bowling. It's the forthrightness of that. Pretty well everything that Whitlam, in terms of a mandate, is in that policy speech. And the most remarkable phrase there is actually under the heading international affairs. And that's where the statement about Australia's responsibility before the world to create a role for our own Aborigines. David has sort of the quote in his paper. I think that's the most profound statement on that issue by any Prime Minister. Others have said something parallel in a different way, including particularly Keating's Redfern Park speech, but no one else has said that as profoundly in terms that the statement ends, a responsibility we cannot escape, share, shuffle off, because the world will not let us forget that. Much could be said about the reverses in Aboriginal affairs policy since Whitlam's period in government. But he has actually again set the standard for what needs to be achieved. And going back to my little theory or reversion of Hedley Bull's theory, that is the case where he moves most beyond the Grotian version of internationalism. This idea that what matters most in world affairs or international politics is orderly relations between states, and domestic affairs are the matter for governments internally, but not a matter for criticism from externally. Whitlam, with his definition of what needs to be achieved with regard to Aboriginal peoples in Australia, was saying this is a matter for the world, and that in a sense leads directly into David's presentation, which is about the use of the external affairs policy and how Whitlam and Murphy have what they did to give a full rendering of the external affairs power. But as well as being honest, Whitlam was forthright and generally, with the exception of the Timor case, not defensive. Many other politicians and prime ministers would say when you're dealing with such a difficult sort of situation as how to recognise properly and create, as he said, a proper role for Indigenous peoples in Australia, they would say, as subsequent prime ministers said, this is not the UN's business. Whitlam actually said the reverse. He said it will be recognised as an international issue and we must accept that. So I'll finish there.